Hello, it's Chris from My Girlfriend's Quilt Shop, and today we're going to start on this really wonderful quilt called Quilting Through the Seasons from Kimberbell. I am so excited. How about you? So in the last video, we talked about prepping our fabrics, getting ready, cutting the fabrics, how to do that, how to prep them with the fusible backing, you know, all the things. And it probably took a bit of time. And that's okay, because you'll be so glad you have it all organized and ready to go. Now today we go ahead and begin on talking about the sentiment blocks. And these are really simple to do. And basically it's just a lot of thread, a little bit longer stitch outs. But what I want to show you is how we go from adding a background quilting design and how to add the sentiment blocks or the applique. It's the same technique throughout, and we're going to do that on the machine. So before we begin, let me share with you what I mean by sentiment block. Like this one is to everything there's a season, and I've already stitched that one out. The same technique happens with this block, which is Life is Sweet, and I love that. That is so sweet, right? As we say. And so both of these would belong in that same technique-based model, okay? So with that being said, let's do the third of those blocks, which, if we take a look down at our instruction manual, is page 19. And they call them the thread work blocks, which makes a lot of sense because it is mostly thread on these. The one that we are going to do in today's video is everything around me, and we just make one block. Our fabric background is 8.5 by 10.5 inches, and we want to make sure and fuse fusible backing onto the back of it, which you can see that I have done right here already. So that's all fused. Now I'm going to take it one step further, and I'm going to add a little light misting of what we call Terrial Magic. Join me over at the ironing station and let me show you how I do that. So oftentimes when there's a quilt design, or a quilt block I should say, that has a lot of stitching, one of the other layers of protection I like to use is something called Terrial Magic. You'll see that I just wrote it on my spray misting bottle. I like to mix a little bit of Terrial Magic with some water, and then I like to do a light misting across my fabric to be able to just add that stiffener to the fabric. Now, one of the things I recommend is that you may find a little bit of dust left from this. And if that is something that you want to make extra careful to not have, there's a couple things you can do. One of the things that I like to do is I actually like to spray it on the back of my quilt block. That way I don't have to worry about it. You can also spray it on the front in a little small area just to kind of test the fabric first and see if it will look okay. And ultimately, if it does put a little of chalk dust on there, all you have to do is take a wet rag and just kind of brush it off, and it will be just fine. But if you feel it, if you could feel through this screen right now, you would feel that this has just a little bit more stability, which again is something I really like to do, especially on blocks that have a lot of stitching. I have my fabric prepped, and I want to talk for just a moment about background quilting. Now, for those of you who have done background quilting before from Kimberbell, you will know exactly what I'm talking about here, and it will make a lot of sense, and it's something that you're probably just going to go, oh yeah, I got this, right? But as a good review, or for those of you who are brand new to background quilting, I want to take a moment just to explain a little bit more about how it works at the machine. Now, when you are doing background quilting in conjunction with a quilt block, more times than not, the background quilting is going to stay behind your main design. So you have background quilting first, you place the design on top. And so that we have a little bit better visual picture of what I'm talking about, what I did here was I printed out these two designs that we are going to be working with. First off is this beautiful background quilting. Again, this is the block by block, and it is KDQ 291 for those of you who are following along with that. We're going to be pulling in the 6x8 design, and so you can see here, this is what the background quilting is going to look like once I'm at my machine. What I also did was I printed out, I'm going to make everything around me beautiful, and that will be my life. Now this is the printout, or I should say the design that's going to fall on top of it. Now again, just as a visual reminder, I'm going to cut this out just so that we can really get our heads wrapped around as to what is happening here. This is something you do not need to do at home. This is simply just for the sake of a visual learning experience, if you will. So when I go to the machine, and you'll see this in just a minute, I bring up my background quilting file first, and that goes behind. Then I do what's called add. And adding the design on top is going to be just as if I were placing the design on top. And you're going to notice that when it goes in, it will actually automatically become centered both vertically and horizontally. Okay, so with that being done, in comes the design. This design is going to stitch on top. Now, obviously, you're going to see through the background the different quilting files, okay, the different florals and the vines here, which makes this so absolutely beautiful. When it comes to an applique, so for example, if I had fabric on here, that fabric would also rest on top of the background quilting. So it makes sense that rather than putting the design first and then the background quilting on top, that would really mean that your background quilting would go over top of, it would be one more additional layer on top of what has already been stitched. And I prefer that the background quilting stays in the background as we, refer to this background in the back, the applique or the design going on top. And again, on your machine, it will automatically come horizontal and vertical. So that is the basic idea behind background quilting. And once again, background quilting design files can be found at kimberbell.com. Now, I also want you to pay close attention to the block by block quilting directions that are found right here in option 1. And it tells us exactly the design that is going to be used and the centered alignment. And then after quilting, we go straight to the embroidery instructions. So what that means is I can skip option 2. This is for those of you who are not going to be doing background quilting. And then I can go straight over here to the embroidery instructions and go from there. Sometimes it will have actually a little tweak in the instructions where perhaps it will have you bring in the design centered, and then sometimes it will move the design down. So again, if we get to that point, I'll make sure and point it out, but always refer back to these instructions before you begin. Now, one more thing I want to mention before we begin, and that is this. When you do background quilting, you will always have your batting included in the design. And oftentimes people will ask, how do I know what size to cut my batting before I take it to the hoop? And the answer is this. Simply go to your instructions on page 19, and I want you to go to the very final instruction in the design, which is always the trimming instructions. And it has us trimming the block to be 6.5 by 8.5 inches. So with that number in mind, all I want you to do is add a 1/2 inch to both of those numbers. So 6.5 would bump up to 7, 8.5 would be bumped up to 9. So all you have to do is cut your batting to be 7 inches by 9 inches. If you'll do that with each of your blocks, then your batting will be ready to go and ready to be placed in the hoop when the time calls for it. So let's go ahead and head over to the machine and let's begin all the fun stitching. The first design I'd like to bring up is the background quilting, which is KDQ 291, and just make sure that you are using the correct size, which on this one is the 6x8 floral. You can see it brought up right here on the screen. Now I'll hit set, and before I embroider, remember there's one more thing I need to do, and that is I need to add my design to the background quilting. So to do that, I'm going to hit add, and again, find it on my USB stick. Bring these up. And right here is KDQ 815. It's the 5x7 design file. And hit set. Now that may not show it very well on the screen. I can certainly see it, but it's because when the design came into it, it was actually in white thread. So that's why you may not see it as well. Now that this is all centered, both vertically and horizontally, I can hit embroider. Right here, you're going to see that I have hooped light mesh cutaway stabilizer all by itself in the hoop. Just slide that in and lock that in place. Place my presser foot down, and the first stitch is going to be the placement outline for my batting. Now I'll place my batting just over that placement line, making sure to cover all of the placement lines around. And we'll do the tack down stitch. This stitch is going to stitch over 2 times, which is nice because pretty soon we'll need to trim all the excess away. I'm going to now remove the hoop from the machine, take it over to my cutting mat, and trim away the excess batting. Now that the excess batting has been removed, the next step is that when I take it back to the machine, it's going to stitch a placement line just a 1/4 inch outside of the batting line. And that's going to show me exactly where to place my background fabric, just like that. Now, there's another really good reason for that line, and that's because it also shows me that the batting is not going to be included in the seam allowance, which is perfect for when it comes time for those blocks to come together after they are all done. Now it's time for my favorite part, that beautiful background quilting. Now, Kimberbell does give you a suggestion for a thread color, which in the book says black. But again, it's entirely up to you. I decided that I wanted to go just with a little bit more contrast, just because I'm so in love with this background quilting that I want it to show up just a little bit. So I'm not going to have it as much of a contrast as if it were black and white, but I'm going to go with just a little bit darker gray with my background quilting, again, just so it shows up. But it's entirely up to you. You get to choose the thread color of your choice, and it is nice that Kimberbell does give us great suggestions on how they did theirs as well. So with that being said, let's go ahead and begin the background quilting. I'm going to switch my thread color now to a cream, and this is going to do the rest of the lettering here. And once this is done stitching out, my block is complete. Our first block is now complete. Isn't it beautiful? Oh, I just love this one. One of my favorites. What I'm going to do now is just pop this out of the hoop, and it's time to square this up. There's a couple different ways we can do this. First off, it tells us in the instructions that we're going to square this up to be a 6.5 by 8.5 inch block. Now, I could do it with the help of my orange pop ruler, which would be perfect. I just go ahead, place that on here. I can also do this. I'm going to just double check my numbers here and see if we're at 6.5 on this outline. This is one of the fun things about doing background quilting, is oftentimes you can get away with just using this outside stitch that is done here. And it looks like I'm good to go. This is definitely 6.5 by 8.5. So on this particular block, I don't need to necessarily use my orange pop rulers. Sometimes you still have to, though, even with the background quilting, because you just want to make sure and measure to see where it ends up lying. Sometimes the fabric will come in a little bit because of the stitching. So I don't always just count on that method of being able to just trim according to the outside lines. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So always double check and be sure. But this time it worked, and take a look at that. Absolutely stunning. I love this block so much, I just might want to use it in some other projects. I'm trying to think, what else could I do with this? If you've got ideas, let me know, because this one is a definite keeper. All right, that's all there is to it. So go ahead, and what I want you to focus on is let's get all of these threadwork blocks done, and you'll be super excited that you are off to a great start. In the next video, we start taking a look at that bicycle and forming the cute little pocket baskets. I can't wait. See you then.